All right.
Well, then we don't need to wait. Hello, everyone. Thank you. Welcome to MarsCon. This panel is, tell me what the name of it is.
Sci-fi literary history and its impact.
Sci-fi literary history and its impact. That is right. I couldn't remember the exact verbiage. Okay. Let me say this. So we are happy to be here. We're happy to talk to you. We're excited to talk to you about sci-fi history, literary history, and its impact. I have some questions I can ask. We probably have things we want to talk about, but you are the ones who decided to spend your dinner hour kind of with us. So what I would like to do is introduce ourselves, and then I'm going to go to you guys first. And if you have anything you want to ask or want us to touch on, I'm going to let you do that instead of trying to squeeze it into 3 minutes at the end there, right? And then we'll kind of jump in and we'll...
Radical.
I know.
Yeah.
This is a Dave Butler, so, you know, we'll see. And it's worked well in the past, so we're going to try it again. So I am David Afsharirad. I'm a Bain editor, and I'll leave it at that. There you go.
I'm Christopher Ruocchio. I was a Bain editor, but I write a science fantasy series called The Sun Eater. I've written 6 books and a bunch of short stories.
I'm David Weber. I've written some stuff.
I'm Ben Yalow. Unlike everybody else on the panel, I am not a professional. On the other hand, I've been reading the stuff for 60 some odd years.
No, not that long.
Not that long.
Haven't been that long, no.
And am fairly familiar with a lot of what was written in the 30s, 40s, 50s.
Okay.
Which is the period that we're talking about.
Yes, I think it said, yeah, through the 70s. So it's sort of like when you start seeing young kids dressing like you dressed in high school, and you're like, what is going on, right? It's like the 70s are ancient literary history that we're talking about its influence, right? Doesn't seem that long ago. All right, does anyone have anything they want us to hit on? Yes, right here.
Could you give an opinion, a voice, anything about the effects of combining the word literary with all its implications and science fiction?
Okay.
I mean, that's tossing the cat among the pigeons.
We're tossing cats to pigeons, and we're asking, is there an implication putting that modifier of literary science fiction?
I think that, okay, I can only speak for myself in this. Okay. To me, literary does not imply anything about for want of a better term, the quality of the science fiction. To me, it implies a way of looking at science fiction. We are looking at it as the literature of science fiction, rather than the nuts and bolts of a current novel or something like that. And so for me, it's a technique for putting stuff into perspective and thinking about the zone in which a book falls, the cycle in which a short story falls, in terms of where science fiction and its relationship to the society around it was at the time that that story was written. For want of, at risk of using a word that has acquired unfortunate tones, it's sort of the context of where the story is in the spectrum of science fiction at large. Does that make sense?
Well, yes, it does, and that answers one of the question. You look at it as a contextual thing rather than a stylistic thing.
I think that you can't look at it as not being a stylistic thing as well, because that's part of the context. Yeah. But to me, it is more about the fact that I'm looking at this as a form of storytelling rather than a particular genre within the storytelling. Okay, I mean, obviously, because you're limiting yourself to science fiction, you are looking at a specific genre. But what I'm saying is I'm considering it in terms that go beyond just this is science fiction. Where is this as storytelling? Where is this as part of the development of the genre, rather than an isolated moment in the genre?
To take a bit of a different angle, I think there's always been a little bit of partisanship amongst writers and amongst editors and you know, critics of the art form since the beginning, right? Verne dismissed Wells as mere entertainment, right? But I think there's always been this sort of, there's been like a subgroup that's always felt like they needed to sort of dignify the the genre to academia in particular. I know I had a professor in college who was a science fiction writer, had some Nebula awards, but he really felt like he needed to like science fiction still needed to prove itself to the Academy, which is something I've never been sympathetic to.
Yeah.
I think it is literature just because it is literature.
Yeah.
And some of it is perhaps more would play better amongst the literati, but I've never been interested in their opinions particularly, or in them. But I think that strain has always been there. I think you could see it in the sort of humanist movement in the 70s and the 80s. They're sort of counter cyberpunk, right? Even with the new wave, there's sort of let's make this a little bit more literary and a little bit less sciencey, right?
I think that's fair, but I think that's the reason why I don't use them in that term.
Yeah, I don't
because
like to
I
talk
reject
about
the
it this
entire.
way either.
It's a
Yeah.
false comparison to me. So I just
But speaking historically, I think that influences.
No, I think
I'm
you're
with
correct.
you. I don't like it.
I think you're correct. But,
And I will go with Campbell's definition, which basically said that what we think of as literary science, what we think of as contemporary literature, is the subset of science fiction that is set in the now and is a very tiny, limited subset of what could be in a science fiction story, so that in fact literary in that sense just means, oh, it's the tiny subset that the critics like, as opposed to the science fiction field, which is much broader, much more all-encompassing, and there's a few minor constraints, and if you have those minor constraints, you're literature. Otherwise, you're science fiction. And again, this is in the time when science fiction and fantasy do not have a hard line between them. I'm not going to try and begin to talk about what is science fiction and what is fantasy.
Over here on the floor, it looks like.
Hi.
There's chairs. You do what you do. You.
I've always sort of felt that sci-fi isn't really a genre in the sense that romance or mystery is a genre, because romance, it has a specific theme, mystery has a specific aim, but sci-fi is so much broader than that. It's almost like you've got nonfiction, you've got fiction, and then you've got science fiction, and that's where the label of science fiction belongs, right up there with the other two. And you can have any other genre you want within that.
I think that's fair. I think that part of it is there's a division between, at all times, there's a division between popular literature and literature, okay? And I think that by and large, science fiction has always fallen into the popular literature. There are a few books which have made the transition into being respectable enough that they are considered literature and not just popular literature. And I point out to people that Shakespeare was the popular literature of his day, and that Mark Twain was the popular literature of his day. And we don't remember too many of the other authors from those periods unless we are taking a course in 19th century literature, okay?
Yeah. Does anyone else have something? Or
Yes, I want to address what both Dave and Ben brought up, which is the transition from that threshold where science fiction went, because the earliest science fiction was very much pulp literature, the real early stuff in the 20s and 30s.
Yes.
At what point did it transition into being taken seriously as literature and or commentary on future trends? I mean, obviously, a lot of the Heinlein in the 50s started doing this. For Leibowitz,
I think that
the 50s,
yeah.
earlier.
I think Heinlein is one of the transitional figures, but I think in some ways he's a transitional figure because that's a ranging mark for time. He was certainly not the only one who was involved in doing that. Some of the early pulps were really, really good. They just weren't considered respectable because that's the venue in which they were appearing. Okay. So I think the transition is more one of public perception than of any change, significant change in the literature itself. Okay, it was the point at which it crossed the threshold into acceptable mainstream literature. And there are people today, I would point to Dean Koontz, who write science fiction, but have managed to not be classified as a science fiction author because he writes, pretty much he transcends genres, okay? And deservedly so, by the way, in my opinion. But part of the problem, I think, is that we want niches that we can fit things into. Marketing loves niches that they can fit things into. But readers like niches that they can fit things into. That they can say, this is what I enjoy reading. This is the kind of stuff I enjoy reading. What is identified as this so that it's flagged for me to enjoy reading? Okay? And I think that was a significant factor in how science fiction evolved as a genre and how specific genres within science fiction evolved. Okay? For whatever it's worth.
Yeah, Dave, can we like jump from there? Because Ben hinted that the lines were much blurrier.
Yeah.
And then now they are. I don't think it's blurry. And in fact, the boxes are like post blah 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 blah. And then Christopher has a point to this that I want you to hit on it, and then I want to segue to him about like sort of the thing you said while we were playing that game. So think about it. Do you not want to say it?
I need more clues.
I'll give you more clues after Ben does.
Okay.
Okay.
I say a lot of stuff, just not on panels.
Let's take a story like Conjure Wife. First of all, it showed up in Unknown. Unknown was John Campbell, the inventor of science fiction. This was his fantasy magazine. So right off the bat, what's going on? Why is John Campbell publishing fantasy? Conjure Wife has appeared right now in a half dozen different genres because an editor will pick up the book, decide the book is brilliant, everybody should read it, I know how to market it, just because every other marketer who's tried has failed. And they come out with a new treatment. It's been horror, it's been gothic, it's been urban fantasy, there was a romance package for it. It doesn't matter. It was a solid enough book that nobody cared. Part of the reason that nobody cared was that until the early to mid-50s, an active science fiction reader could read everything that was published in the field, which meant that you didn't say, oh, I'm looking for only the thing in this tiny little niche, because there might not be anything in this tiny little niche. You would read everything you could get your hands on, because it was all within the genre. It meant that people could play with the genres. It meant that you could have scientific magic. You can argue what was the first scientific magic. We know about when it was. It was in the 40s. You can have, but you see that right now with Poul Anderson was writing something like Operation Chaos, which was scientific magic, and he dedicated it to Heinlein's wife because for him the original story was Magic Incorporated. And that for him was the first scientific magic. And of course, Magic Incorporated is a noir detective story. Oh yeah.
Yeah, so we're talking about and the influence, right? That's the second part of this panel. So,
can I throw one?
Yeah, and can we kind of trace that influence of it was all we could read it all, now we get
one of
the Plinko board.
The differences is the potential pool of titles was not as deep. There wasn't as much of it, and therefore it was easier for somebody to read essentially all of it. Okay, you had fewer writers, and they were producing. There was a lot more being produced in short fiction than in novels. during his period. And so you could read just about everybody out there. Today, there are so many authors out there, the field has gotten so much broader that it's almost a little bit of the flies conquering the flypaper in a sense, because nobody has time to read everything that's out there, so you tend to be more discriminating in picking which genres, which types of stories, which types of authors you're going to read. And so that's where some of the hardness of the lines, I think, has come in. I'm sorry, I just wanted to throw
No, that's great.
Yeah, and it's gotten messier too, right? Because there is so much stuff now, that there isn't really a single fandom in the way that there was, you know, in decades past, right? There are as many as there are kinds of things to read at this point, and so your grammar as a fan, as a reader, is different from everyone else's. You know, when my books came out, people said, "Oh, you were like clearly inspired by Pierce Brown," and I was like, "Who is that?" And like, "Oh, he's a New York Times bestseller." I'm like, "Oh, like I can miss a New York Times bestseller and sit on a panel at science fiction conventions, right?" Yeah. There's like that many, right? And so there's this weird Tower of Babel effect that sort of happened, where just the sort of book, like we don't have the same books in common anymore in the way that it used to be.
There's also, I kind of bridge the gap between ebooks and hard copy. Okay, when War of Honor went to the New York Times list, we shipped something like, I think, 60,000 copies in hardcover. When Uncompromising Honor went to the list, we shipped less than 20 in hardcover. The rest were ebooks that put it up there. Now, one of the things about ebooks is it also makes self-publishing and indie publishing houses easier. What that means is that the output goes up enormously. It means that you will be able to read stories. The best thing about it is you'll be able to read stories you would never have seen otherwise. The worst thing about it is you'll be able to read stories you never have seen otherwise. Okay? Because unfortunately, the fact that you can publish it easily doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to be published.
Right.
Okay.
There's a big noise signal problem.
Yes, and that becomes a problem for readers, especially readers who want to support the indies and want to support the self-published. Is how do you filter that to know this is the person I want to read, this is the person I wish him well, but you know, kind of thing, and that becomes a significant issue as well.
Anyone else have something else?
One thing I've noticed, as the language evolves, the English language in this case, words that had one meaning in the 30s, 40s, have now, that we're reaching, 2020s, have changed. How do you feel that affects someone grasping what was trying to be said at that time?
It can be huge. H.B. Piper was one of the innovators about putting women into the military and everything else. If you read The Uprising, he's got this briefing where he's got this tough-as-nails sergeant, she's briefing people, she's using cartridges for map markers and everywhere else. And because the language is still in transition, he describes her as the girl sergeant. Okay, every 21st century woman who is that goes, kind of thing. Well, the problem is he was ahead of his time, and therefore the language hadn't caught up with him. And so I think that Eric Flint had a point when he says that some bowdlerization of bringing somebody from the 40s to 50s up to speed is in order because of the way that words' meanings have shifted, the implications of them have shifted. I think you have to be extraordinarily careful about that, be very respectful of the original. In fact, my preference would be where you bowdlerize as an editor, you footnote the fact that you did and explain why you did it, because I think it should be done you should be cherry enough about doing it that there shouldn't be a whole bunch of footnotes when you get in there. But something like that needs to be flagged, or somebody reading it. Roger Zelazny has some of the same problems, some of his earlier fiction. Okay, oddly enough, I've had a whole bunch of women readers and writers who have complained about Heinlein heroines.
Yeah.
Okay, and I think some of that is language perception, but I think another problem is he wrote strong women from a male perspective of what made a strong woman. Okay, which is not necessarily the same as the perspective of a woman as to what makes a strong woman. Now, I knew a Heinlein heroine who did her, who broke a Nazi sabotage ring during World War II as an inspector in a B-24 plant. When the war was over, she went back to making cookies because that was what she wanted to do. Okay, that individual was my grandmother. So in that perspective, I understand where Heinlein's coming from for heroines. But you can see, we're talking about the legacy of literary fiction. Yeah. There you've got some of the evolution of how we're going to treat this, how we're going to construct this character. And it's not just in women. Okay, there are other tropes. On the way up, this car had been pulled over for speeding. And as I'm going by, the sheriff's deputy who had pulled is waving the arm at me, so I said, I guess I was speeding, so I pulled over. Well, what she was trying to tell me was, get in the left lane as you go by, so I pull over. And I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, okay, here I am, I'm on a southern highway, okay? Bear in mind I was born in 1952, all right? So I'm sitting here and I'm looking at it. Here is a female black sheriff's deputy who can't be over 32, working the road by herself, and nobody's turning a hair over it, okay? How in the world can you look at science, even science fiction that was written in the 50s and the 40s, even the 60s, and not bear in mind how the societal matrix has shifted, okay? But at the same time, we have to be aware of the roots of that literary fiction. We have to be aware. I handed Andre Norton to somebody, and they said, oh, you know, I tried that, but so-and-so does it better. And I'm like, so-and-so is standing on Andre's shoulders because she's the one who opened the other genre, the whole, you know, kind of thing. And I hate it when people don't have that context. But how do you expect somebody who is a science fiction reader in their late 20s, early 30s to be aware of who I was reading when I was 20 or 30?
Christopher, how do you expect a science fiction reader in their late 20s, early 30s?
To be aware of this? Well, I'm weird, right? In that I had someone very much like Ben for a high school English teacher. So I'm reading books that are out of phase mostly. Yeah. You know, so that's the answer to that question.
Okay.
But no, I mean, there was a point you wanted me to.
Well, you kind of hit on it, but we can go back to it. That we're okay. So like,
I didn't want to lose it.
No. I saw a thing, and it was the movie A Christmas Story. And this is not science fiction, but stay with me for 1 minute. They made a sequel to it recently called Christmas Story. And there's something pointed out, like, it's 2023, I think the movie came out last year, 2022, we're watching a sequel set in the 70s, made now, set in the 70s, that is a sequel to a movie that came out in the 80s, based on a book, set in the 40s, that was based on a book that was actually probably set in the 20s. And like, oh my gosh, like, and it's like, this is, I love Christmas Story. I haven't seen the sequels. It may be very good, but like that's kind of fumes, right? And so I think your point was sort of like, are we just doing, and is it enough to just kind of do new versions of the things that have come previously? You know, like, or is that a good thing? Is it fine that we're doing new versions of this, you know, only, or maybe not only, but is that your point? Maybe it wasn't your point. We were playing that game and I was going cross-eyed.
No, that was not quite what I was saying. I think what you were talking about from earlier was a little bit different. Was that there is instead there's a pressure to do new things all the time, at least in writing.
Okay.
Right? Like,
yes. We'll
like
go with that.
Not from
Ignore
Hollywood,
my
right?
Christmas stories.
Right? No. I think this is a completely unrelated.
Okay, we'll make a completely unrelated point.
But you would not believe how many times I've had this exact sort of conversation with Sharon.
Yeah.
Okay, and she says, "Shut up, or I'll hit you." Okay.
No, this is totally unrelated. We can go to another question.
Except for the fact that, in a sense, I mean, Terry Pratchett set this world in Lankmar. There is no question he set this world in Lankmar, and the number of people who have never read anything by Fritz Leiber is regrettable but large. But again, as was just said, you're standing on the shoulders of the predecessor. the people who wrote the vocabulary wrote it, and everybody else tweaks it a bit, which is good.
I think it goes a little farther than that, because I think we're not tweaking it. I think we're part of evolving it.
Carrying it forward.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So this is what
This
we're
is the
talking
point.
about.
Okay, there we go.
Right.
I knew
So
we-
if I get one consistent thread of criticism, it's that I like Frank Herbert and Gene Wolfe too much. Right. And one that's impossible, at least in Gene Wolfe's case. But the second thing is that as a consequence of readers who are like my age who've never heard of Gene Wolfe, in particular, they've heard of Frank Herbert. You know, they go and then read Gene Wolfe, right? And so this is one way that we as writers can, you know, can point to the writers that made us and sort of keep them alive. This is one of the things that I liked doing when I was editing a band, because we would do these short story collections, and my co-editor Hank Davis had like has an eidetic memory, despite the fact that he can't remember what day of the week it is at this point. God bless him. For stories that were published throughout this period, you could ask him what was the cover story, February, 1952, and he would tell you without having to look, right? And then he would go find the magazine in the office and hand it to me and be right every time, right? And so we would find these stories that hadn't been reprinted and reprint them, right? So we found like Paul Anderson's that hadn't been reprinted. We found an Asimov that hadn't been reprinted ever, right? And we would bring those back into print. Right, but by that same token, right, you do the same thing, right, or I do the same thing, just by introducing writers that people people my age don't know about to them, right, in the first place.
Well, one of the things that I say in writing workshops, okay, it's the writer's voice that sells the story ultimately. Okay, there are certain types of stories that person A won't read, person B won't read, but what makes or breaks the story is the writer's voice. And you have to develop your own voice, but you also have to be aware that your voice is the product of every other writer's voice you've ever heard, that it's a synthesis, it's ongoing, and if you're doing your job right, it should be growing as you go along, okay? The same thing is true about the language of science fiction. And I'm not talking here just about vocabulary shifts. I'm talking about the evolutions of the kinds of stories that we write and the ability to trace the lineage of the stories that we read and that we write. And there is a lineage, okay, because we are the heirs of those who wrote before us. And we are producing what will be the next generations of writers, their heritage.
This is the great conversation.
Yeah, and that I think is where authors from the golden age, if you will, come in. I don't really think there was a golden age of science fiction. What I think there was a breakthrough age of science fiction, an age in which the literature came of age enough to be acceptable in major bookstores, to be discussed in major literary forums. But it wasn't so much because of the quality of the writing, superb as much of it was, as it was the access into the writing, okay? So in that sense, I don't think there's been a golden age. I think we're in an ongoing, if you will, golden age in a lot of respects, because the genres continue to grow and to change and to expand. What I have seen as, I think, a disturbing trend here in the last 15 years is the way in which the partisan divides that we are looking at as a society are creeping into how we regard science fiction, and in some cases how the science fiction is written, okay? Because it's a perfectly legitimate, valid exercise of literature to look at those divides, but I think that it has a negative impact on our ability to say, you know what, I like this person's writing, even though I think that politically he's a Neanderthal, or she is hopelessly woke, or whatever. You know, we lose that ability. We restrict ourselves. And that's unfortunate. Especially because I think we would find that a lot of what we're saying is the same thing. I think that most of our divides, if we looked at it, most of us want the same thing. We disagree on how we get there to accomplish it. And I hate to see that spilling over But by the way, you can see it in the 40s and the 50s very clearly as well. When you're looking, I mean, if you, my God, if anybody ever reads E.E. Smith, who I happen to love, okay? I mean, there's a totalitarian Cold War mindset all the way through those books that is difficult to sustain if you're thinking about it in a post-Cold War age, because we're back into more of a multipolar situation, so you're not going to have that. I mean, the good guys are obliterating entire planets, okay? You're like, okay, I guess you had to do that. You know, you throw around planetary masses of antimatter. These things happen, you know.
You know,
Oops.
normal day, right?
Yeah. I saw a meme on Facebook, and it's the Admiral, it's like, Admiral, John Wick's dog lived on Aldebaran. You know, it's like, yeah, I'm sorry, I'm straight.
That's good though.
There's sort of an associated danger with this, though, right? Like, even if people don't want the same things, right? By bringing let's say, too heavy a lens to the historical study, right? You know, when you do history, you can't strip out your perceptions completely, but you try not to like be so blind or so blinkered that you ignore huge swaths of our history. When you ignore swaths of science fiction history, you ignore good books.
Yeah.
Right? And like that's just not fun.
Yeah,
right? Like forget, set all the partisan stuff aside for a second. Like, there are good books, period, that you won't read or won't even know exist because the history gets so bent.
The bad books that are the result of our partisan divide are the books which are driven by message rather than by character and story. The ones in which somebody sets out to sharpen a particular knife, okay, because it becomes a voice lecturing at you rather than a voice engaging you.
And if a writer is skillful enough, then yes, there's a lecture in there, but you're carried on through that because the story, the characters, all of those things are such that you don't care. Poul Anderson, if you look at Poul Anderson's career and compare the political viewpoint that he had in a story like Unman, which is very much to the left, to the stories that he was writing in the post-Flandry universe, which are very much of the libertarian right. And this is the same Poul Anderson who was able to tell convincing stories such that whether you liked the politics or disagreed massively with the politics, he was telling an interestingly well done story and you didn't care. You said, oh my God, I love this writing, I love this character, I love the way the plot moves. I don't care about the fact that I hate the politics that he seems to be espousing in this story, because he's doing so in a way that he's telling a story, and oh yes, the politics is there, but he's telling a story.
Well, I think, I've said this before, when you begin writing, whether you want to or not, you step onto a soapbox, because your views, your understanding infuse how you build characters. Okay? And if I make a political view that would otherwise be abhorrent to you, accessible to you because it's held by a character I've built well, you understand that character's motivations, and therefore you are looking at that through that person's eyes, then, I may not have set out to do that, but it can still happen, okay? We need to be aware when we're writing that happens, though. Okay, as writers, we need to be aware that is one of the things that happens. And I've had people assume that I was throwing a message at them that I had no idea was anywhere in the book, and that, as far as I'm aware, wasn't. but it was the way that they were reading it from their life experience. And sometimes when they explained it to me, I could see exactly why they got it, and other times I was like, huh? When they got done explaining it to me. And I have lost a thread of something that I wanted to say. So I'm going to sit here.
We got this guy. He's got a thought.
You can basically boil it down to entertain, then explain.
Yeah, entertain, then explain. I had a thought, which is, I think, on this idea of the effects and the influence. And maybe could you talk about how those of you who've done it and been what you've seen reading, sort of the idea of this is influenced by, this is in conversation with, versus this is just a warmed over version of something we've already seen. You know, and how do you prevent that from happening? Is it important to try to prevent that from happening? And Ben, like, have you seen examples, or what's just as a reader and a historian of the genre?
To pick something right off the presses right now, Bain just published a story by Mona Lisa Foster. It is a Lee Brackett story. She is very upfront about it. She says in the introduction, this is a Lee Brackett story. And by God, it is a Lee Brackett story. It's a Lee Brackett in her writing for Westerns for the movies, rather than Lee Brackett in her Sword and Planets phase. But it feels like Lee Brackett.
I disagree with you. I love the story. But where I would disagree with you is it doesn't feel like Lee Brackett to me.
It feels like a reinterpretation of Lee Brackett.
It's Mona Lisa Foster
it's her
writing
voice.
in a Lee Brackett era,
in
right,
2023.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Trust me, it's delightful. You know, it's now, you know, talking about soapboxes and where you can go wrong. Okay, Steve Sterling, when he first introduced the Draka, you should have seen, or maybe you did see some of the, KKK wet dream, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what they totally failed to grasp was that Steve had built the most disgusting, terrible villain that he could think of, because this was a person who considered they were totally rational in what they were doing. And then he played fair with the character. Okay? I've seen that. Steve is perhaps the most glaring example of it that I've seen. It was superb writing, but it hurt his acceptability because of how the people who were reading the book were assuming that he was approaching it, which was not the case at all.
Christopher, I know you've been, like, as you said earlier, like, accused of being too, and to an extent, maybe, you know, you can't do anything about it, but how do you see those differences of, like, oh, this is like a warmed over versus this is something that's in conversation with?
Well, I think this is where we started to go earlier, and then we got confused. I think mostly me. Well, I got confused, but
I was also.
But when I was saying that there is this pressure, I think, on writers to come up with something as original as possible, and readers get very upset when they see things that they recognize from other works of literature. I find that this is weirdly, like, unique to speculative fiction, because my readers will be like, "Hey, this was a Dune thing, that was a Gene Wolfe thing. What are you doing?" But they never say that was a Dante thing. That was a Shakespeare thing, right? Never once has anybody complained about, like, all the Dante references. So, like, those were cool, right? And this is where we get back to the, like, is science fiction literature thing, because people, when they do this, are treating Dante as literature. They're treating science fiction, treating Dune as intellectual property, right? And there is this tendency, I think, increasingly, to look at art as merely product, right? Now, obviously, we're trying to sell books. So it is, right?
By the book.
But right, it's not only that, right? Like, literature, you know, like there's a euphemism in like, you know, like literature studies for, you know, we don't say Western canon anymore, but Western canon, right? As the great conversation, right? You know, all these writers are, like, deeply hyperlinked, right, with each other, right, with earlier writers, with scripture, right, with Homer, whatever, right? And I, like, you know, I never thought about science fiction and fantasy as not part of that, right? Like, why would they be? Right now, I'm not one of those people who, like, very foolishly says, "Oh, the Iliad is fantasy." No, it wasn't, right? Like, they didn't have an idea of fantasy. It's also, like, kind of crazy thing to say about people's actual historical and religious beliefs, however erroneous they may be, right? But like clearly, like science fiction is literature, right? It's always been sort of hyperlinked to the earlier traditions of literature and to other contemporary ones, right? And so I've never sort of thought about it differently. And so in my own writing, I've always thought, why treat Dune any differently than Homer?
And
or,
and the field used to very actively reflect the fact that we were all in conversation. When Joe Haldeman came out with Forever War, he was in conversation with Starship Troopers. There was no question that the two books, in a sense, are addressing the same issues, the same totally different voices. I mean, Heinlein was, after all, Heinlein was Navy and Joe Haldeman was Army. So clearly they're going to take different approaches. But the two stories were very much reacting to each other. And then when John Scalzi came out with Old Man's War, he was again, in a sense, assuming that you had already read both Starship Troopers and Forever War.
Yeah, and even older too, earlier and more flagrantly, right? Lovecraft name checks like Clark Ashton Smith by name, right, and by world building too, right? And Poe for that matter, right? In Mountains of Madness, he's referencing the Poe Antarctic story and like has world building notes from that story in there, right? So like this is like not unusual, but it has become increasingly common for readers to be like, why did you do that? Like, you think you could slip a Star Wars reference by me? Me? I've seen Star Wars. So has everybody, bro. Like, I thought you would laugh, right? Like, I would be like, oh, that was cute, right? But no. So it's a strange sort of attitudinal shift, and it's a weird way too of sort of, I hesitate to say ghettoizing science fiction. Like, you can't actually play with the books that you grew up.
I totally agree with you, but by the same token, I think part of it, and I hate to bring Hollywood into this because, I mean, you know, dirty word, actually two dirty words combined. But one of the problems I think we have is the number of Hollywood productions which have been essentially rinse and reproduce.
That is fair.
And I think it's spilling over into literature as well with people who are so worn out with Hollywood doing that they think that's what they're seeing in the fact that you are referencing these older, older existing books. But it's really just pushing this off the table, aren't we? The degree to which, this is my personal experience, okay? The degree to which people are upset with something that I've done that, is a touchback to something earlier, is the degree to which they think I lifted it directly and inserted it into my work. And usually I've been able to, when somebody, you did so, I say, oh, no, look here, this is what really happened, kind of thing. Yeah, and sometimes you get hit because you never read it. Okay, Path of the Fury, okay, the original Furyverse novel. I wrote that novel, I sent it off to Bain, okay, I sent a copy of the manuscript to Sue Phillips down in Atlanta, who is my sister-in-law, ex-sister-in-law. And Sue says, this is fantastic. Do you know the Filk, Fury? And I'm like, the what? Oh, God. And she said, the Filk, Fury. And I said, no, what are you talking about? And she said, well, this is a perfect illustration of the Filk. And I'm like, the what? Okay, kind of thing. And so I got a copy of it, and she was right. Okay, I mean, it's like there was some sort of mental transfer somewhere along the way. That, I mean, there are a lot of differences as well, but I mean, there are whole elements in this story that match exactly with the film. And I have, upon occasion, had somebody come up to me and say, man, I love the way that you, and I'm like, no, it didn't happen. But that can happen to you too.
That's because it is like this web, right? So if you're all pulling from different strands, it doesn't have to be a direct. When do we stop? 5 or 10 before? 10. 10 before. Okay, so we got about 5 minutes. Does anyone else have something they wanted to?
Well, we've had a hand over here.
Okay, you tell me that. Yeah.
I worked in the field as a librarian, buying and selecting, those genres. But what I like the way this conversation is talking and building on the shoulders. For instance, Piper who is one of my true golden authors. When we update an author or we have an author follow with them, I think the whole point of science fiction is a mirror of our times and saying, well, what is this trend? And we go here with it.
Yep.
And talk more about that, how that's an ongoing, I look at it as an ongoing conversation. Hopefully we can keep the partisan side out of it for.
I have to say that when I mention Mac Reynolds, people look at me like, huh? Or Cymac, or a bunch of the folks that I was reading, you know, and they're like, huh? All right, that hurts me. It also makes me feel really old.
There's someone in the back, I think that.
I just would have been thinking throughout this panel about how growing up I read a lot of my mother's old paperbacks of like Andre Norton and things from that era, and I almost feel like I can't read it now in the sense that it's not as enjoyable to me because of the way I feel some of not the writing, but some of the concepts have aged. Like when I just danced out of the dealer's room because I was really excited because I found a copy of something by Joanna Russ, which I've read only one short story, and then I got really excited because I didn't know she wrote a novel. So I've gone from that era of like reading, and then progressing to now, I was trying to find paperbacks of some ebooks that I liked. And when I was wandering around Barnes & Noble, I didn't even realize it was science fiction.
Yeah.
So how do I go back and try and find things that I can enjoy and digest without getting angry at them?
I don't know, that'd be a you question.
Okay, all right. The problem I think probably, and this is not a criticism, okay? The problem is probably a present day-itis in reading the older material. It's like I was saying about Piper and the word choice that would keep you from seeing what he was actually saying because the words have evolved differently since then. I can tell you the first science fiction novel that I ever read was The Legion of Space, okay? I had broken an arm, I was about 10, I'd read all the Black Stallion novels and everything else. I said, oh, I'll try this. And the second was Genus Homo by Sprague de Camp and P. Schuler Mitchell, which is really the basis of all the Planet of the Apes movies, if you look back at it. Okay? Those books would not have aged well if I went back and read them today. All right? But they're still good stories. The furniture has changed. And so it's very difficult. If you're going to go back to an earlier era of any literature, all right, you have to check as much as possible of your present day at and be willing to take it on in terms of when it was written. Okay, and that's hard to do, especially when you read for pleasure.
Right, yeah, you're not obligated. It's different if you're studying the genre as a writer, or because I do think you should be versed in it. Versus like I just want to kick back and relax before going to bed. It's like I think you have a different responsibility depending on why you're reading.
I had a conversation with Andre Norton about 2 years before her death, and I said, your stuff will always be here. And she said, no. I said, what? She said, nobody wants it anymore. Okay, and I was thinking about that when I was thinking about the person who told me, well, Andre Norton doesn't do it as well as so-and-so. Okay, so-and-so to me is a lightweight Johnny-come-lately, Jill-come-lately. In this case, I won't say who it was. But I understand where that reader is coming from. That reader is 40 years younger than me. Okay, when I read Andre Norton, she was still very much mainstream. But I will say this, my mother, who never reads science fiction, recognized Andre Norton's name because she wrote The Prince Commands, which was my mother's favorite novel when she was 12. That's how long Andre Norton was writing out there in the field. And people like, who?
Well, I think, if I may say, there is maybe, it's okay to, I guess you were asking about finding new things that are old, but I think it's okay to also leave some of that behind and say, I loved that when I was 12. I still love it in that in my memory, but I don't need to reread it
I don't
today.
go back and
I mean,
read
you
the
know.
Black Stallion novels,
Right.
or You
You
Were
know.
There at the Battle of
The
Lexington
person
Concord.
the person who read that book years ago is not the same person today, so the taste has changed. Maybe.
Yeah, I
So,
mean,
okay,
if you want like an actual concrete answer on how to find older writers, maybe go look at old awards listings, right? You know, and try that. Find a writer that whose book you liked off that listing, and read their other stuff.
You also like reverse engineer. This is what I always did with music, but stuff like, okay, I like the Beatles. Well, who did the Beatles like? Well, then who did that guy like? And then who
That's
did
the
that
other
guy
thing too,
like?
right?
You know,
is
you
go like
backwards.
3 steps back from your favorite writer. Figure out who their novelist's great grandmother is.
Joy Freeman, last.
So one of the things,
We all have them.
one of the sad parts of all this, yes, I can just tell myself, oh, don't go reread that. It won't stand up today. I want to convey to my 20-year-old, I want to be able to hand off an Andre Norton book and have him enjoy it. So when I did that, and I did, and he loved it, it was because we talked ahead of time about the fact that if I were handing you a book set, written in Japan, you're going to know ahead of time, hey, this was a different culture.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to read it through that lens.
Yeah, the past is a different country.
Do you know an author who I have found who is very, very good for getting people to look at earlier books? Zena Henderson.
Say it again, please.
Zena Henderson.
Oh, we were just
okay.
talking about her.
This is
That is
weird.
super weird.
Okay, yeah.
It was like the 4th time.
Yeah.
Did you say Xena as in
Z-E-N-N-A.
It's Z-E-N-N-A.
Zena Henderson.
There are
The people, the
short plug.
Yeah.
Nesfa Press has put Nesfa
Yes.
Press has put out 2 volumes. One of her people stories, one of her non-people stories. They are in print now, so you can find them. Read them.
Zena Henderson. Okay, I incorporated David and the Phoenix into an Honor Harrington novel. It's one of my favorite childhood books, and it holds up. Okay, it holds up really well if you go back and read it. There is older fiction out there which is timeless in the way that it tells the story. Okay? And I think that we have, science fiction is speculative fiction, but it is also the one that incorporates the most of present day into projected stories, because that's where we're coming from when we're writing the science fiction. Okay? Even more than fantasy does. Science fiction does. Now, there's fiction that is written specifically to be set in the 21st century, I'm talking about, and it hurts us sometimes because the furniture is built into the story, and sometimes the furniture doesn't age because the concerns of the people who are reading it are different. All right?
I think we gotta stop.
Yeah.
I wish we didn't. Do you have one quick last?
Yes,
It's
but I
gotta
would
be real quick.
recommend, I just handed off The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, which is 50 years old by Robert Heinlein, to my 25-year-old daughter who's a computer engineer with Microsoft, and she loved it.
Oh, I know you like
And
for
it's so
Heinlein.
timely,
Yeah.
you can talk about deep fakes, you can talk about non-binary characters.
Go wrong.
It is relevant to today.
On the other hand, Glory Road is preachy and sucky.
Whoa.
Okay, now I have to tell you, when Ruocchio is explaining that he learned to shave shaving corpses in the Undertaker's Emporium, when he's shaving Oscar before the thing, that's a classic moment. Okay? But I will say
Fair
that
enough.
Starr represents everything that I think most women don't like
Especially
about
setting
his
him up by
characters.
not telling him about the bed mores.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone here, panel. Thank you, audience. We appreciate you.